So with that said, I'm going to hand you over to our moderator, Florence, to take it from there.
Hi everyone, thanks very much Mark. Pleasure to be here this evening to chat about this very interesting subject. A little introduction to myself. So I'm listed as Grown It on the speaker list. That's an education startup that I set up a few years ago to use vertical growing technology and agri-tech as an educational tool. My CV's changed slightly actually in the last year, and I now work full-time for the Food Foundation on city food policy, looking at urban agri-tech as a tool that cities can support in terms of encouraging entrepreneurship and innovation within the cities is something that comes up a lot and is discussed, but I have yet to see it be proposed as a solution to food insecurity. So I'm really interested to see where this conversation goes tonight, and if we come up with any great ideas that I can pass on to some of the cities that we work with. So hopefully most of you had a chance to watch the video that Mark mentioned that we recorded, but just a quick recap in case you haven't. So we started by looking at the context of the food system that we live in today and some of the challenges that we face both environmentally and socially. We then went on to consider what food insecurity is, and I put it in the context of inequality, and that food insecurity is a symptom of wider systemic wealth inequality. We looked at urban agriculture and the impact that it can have on our physical health, our mental health, on our communities, our social lives, our societies, as well as systemically and economically. And we then dipped into a few examples, both from the States actually, in how agri-tech has been used to address some issues of food insecurity. Two examples at food banks or community food projects where they've used the technology as a way for local people to access fresh produce, hyper-local fresh produce, and two examples, both from New York, of some amazing educational approaches to educational uses of mainly hydroponic growing as well. So without further ado, I'm going to start handing over to some of our guests who are going to introduce themselves and give a quick background as to their work. So I'm going to come to you first, Nicole.
Sorry, unmute myself. Hi everybody, thank you for having me. My name's Nicole. I'm a co-founder and director of Cultinova. We are essentially a technology provider, so I'm doubly excited to be here, you know, wearing my technology hat and thinking about the social impact of controlled environment agriculture. My company provides monitoring, control and data solutions for sustainable controlled environment agriculture. I'm also a proud member of UK UAT and also a member of this cluster for sustainable cities. So I'm very passionate about leveraging technology and especially data and Internet of Things technologies, which is our core business, to really make a difference to the way that we produce our food, but also the way that we consume our food and maybe even engage citizens. So thank you for having me.
Great, thanks Nicole. Chris, can we come to you please?
Yeah, thanks Florence. My name's Chris Jones. I'm a landscape architect and urban designer by training. And in recent years, I've sort of made a sidestep into the world of urban ag as similar to yourself, Florence, a way of tackling so many of the challenges that urban areas face, but also the relationship with peri-urban areas. You know, the food is something that unites everybody, and it can be quite low threshold or quite high tech and everything in between. And when you get it right, you can plug in so many different synergies, whether it be from using empty buildings to looping elements of the circular economy, creating opportunities where there don't seem to be any. And most importantly for me was that it can really empower people. I've done projects around the world from India to Indonesia to across Europe in very different contexts. But when you put food at the core of your solutions, then you allow everybody to find an entry point and to work constructively towards achieving the big objectives. So I'm looking forward to the conversations.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. Kevin.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for inviting me along tonight. So my name's Kevin Frediani. I'm currently the curator of University of Dundee Botanic Gardens, and I look after the grounds. But my background and sort of journey with vertical farming goes right the way back. In 2008 in Amsterdam, we were looking at putting our nursery on top of a building in Amsterdam because building space is expensive in the middle of the cities, and it made sense to do that. And as part of that learning, I was introduced to the Dutch horticultural industry and their developments with controlled environmental agriculture. It wasn't called that back then. And when I came back to the UK in 2008, I had the opportunity with, you probably remember them, Valcent, to develop the first indoor vertical farm in the UK. Which at that time we were calling it high density vertical growing. So it shows you this sort of, these acronyms and language has changed all over the time, and just trying to find, where do you ground this? But my interest at that time was in a zoo running a botanic garden. We had a lot of visitors who were coming to see animals in captivities, and I wanted to show them that the reason we have zoos and we need to conserve animals and the last orchid, as I call my story with the plants, is because of the way that we unsustainably use the land out there. And so I see urban agriculture, or I saw urban agriculture as a way of helping feed our hungry cities, to disrupt the supply chains, think a little bit more about where our food came from, and in the process of resolving that, help our cities become sustainable ecosystems, which ultimately is what we need to survive on this planet with wild spaces for wildlife. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kevin. Andrew.
Hiya, thanks for inviting me here tonight. Very excited to be here. So I'm a recent engineering graduate, but I actually got into the vertical farming sector back in 2019. I worked at a summer at a company called Farm Urban, which I see there's a former employee in the audience here, so hello Sam. But yeah, so at Farm Urban, I carried out a technical role there, sort of researching growing systems. But at the same time as this, I was participating in their education workshops, where we'd go to schools and carry out sort of workshops with various different ages of schools, and got to see how they got to engage with like STEM, technology, and thinking about wider food security. More recently, I've graduated and co-founded a company called Glasgow Greens. We operate a vertical farm here in Glasgow, where we built some grow systems, build them up from the ground, and we're developing our process to create a sustainable way into the Glasgow food city network, and we hope to distribute our foods locally to enhance food security within the city. Great,
thank you very much. Fantastic. So I think a really clear place to start our conversation is by asking the four of you, based on your experience in the field, where do you think controlled environment agriculture fits in the battle against food insecurity and towards a more just food system? I'm going to come to Chris first.
Thanks. No, for me, it's really what I find really interesting is it's about making a meal. Are you growing an ingredient or are you growing a product? And so a lot of early stage controlled environment agriculture focusing on a specific produce. Maybe it would be a lettuce or something, but not really doing the market research and failing because the business case failed. So on the one hand, if you're looking from that CEA point of view, you have to do your market analysis and work out what are you going to grow that you can sell in the local market. But I also think it's really interesting to look at it as an ingredient in the wider food system. So as cities, they waste a huge amount of food, and a lot of that food you could add value to. I mean, you can distribute it via a food bank, but you're not really adding value, and you're sort of supporting a wasteful system. Some of it, your perishables, you can't really design out the waste so easily, but you can perhaps add value to it when you combine it with other things that you could grow in the CAA context. For example, perhaps, when you grow, looking at your microgreens and your herbs, and you would add those to some of the perishables that might otherwise end up in landfill, then you're adding value to that waste product. And that can also be part of a more community-based development strategy, and maybe also tie in with the community growers and your small farms and your peri-urban market gardeners. And so you try to put all of those different aspects together with CEA as well, where that can be really useful. I think that's something that's very interesting for me to explore from the, the context of landscape and urban design. It's about, the leftover spaces of the cities, the abandoned buildings in the cities, and all of those, finding those relationships that make sense and create opportunity for loads of different people and different entry points.
So are you suggesting integrating it into sort of more community growing spaces in an accessible way, or adding value kind of as a commercial product?
I think both. I think traditionally it's looked more like a sort of a factory kind of approach of we're going to grow something and we're going to sell something, and not necessarily as how do we fit into the rest of the chain? Who else can we help support? Who can support us? So maybe it's a community farm sort of exploring CEA, or maybe it's CEA like you've got Vertical Harvest in the US, who is very much community based, but still vertical growing. But I think also you see a lot of one of the criticisms. You've got the criticism of the business case sometimes on CEA of the energy use, but also whenever people put their microgreens and their salads on Instagram, the first thing is, what are you using those plastic boxes for? You see all of the loads of the comments. And when you start working with the rest of the food ecosystem in a city, then you get into that zero waste network. You get a different kind of distribution potential, perhaps. So I think those are opportunities which can really help each other.
Great. Thanks very much, Chris. Andrew, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I think CEA is sort of, in recent years, there's been a lot of technological developments, particularly in lighting and controlled environment, which has sort of allowed the companies to bring the production of especially leafy greens and other kind of costly like microgreens as well, able to bring the production of these greens away from countries like Spain or the Netherlands, for instance, and bring it local. This has a lot of benefits. One of the main ones is the freshness of the product. The food has a much longer shelf life, so you can much more easily distribute it around the city. And furthermore, having local access to this food can bring a lot of communities that may not have a shop nearby or easy means to this food to have a greater way of getting into it. So I think as well, as the technology develops further, these systems will become more efficient and the cost of this food should hopefully come down. I think that's the main issue right now, as has been commented on by a lot of people, is that it's great, you've got all these fancy systems producing all this food, but it's no use if what you end up with is basically a food that's can only really be sold in M&S or something like that. It's pushing a lot of people away. So I think one of the biggest drivers for the industry right now is to engage, push technology as far as we can to bring down the price. I think that's the key.
Great, thank you. Nicole?
Well, I agree with everything that's been said so far. I'd say that I agree with Chris in terms of having to adopt a systemic approach. I think having worked at the intersection between urban food production and urban greening, it's become very clear to me from a very early stage that we need to almost integrate the different aspects of urban food production, but also urban greenery, in order to reap the maximum benefits. And I think if we go down multi-use spaces, I think this is also something that, if I envision my ideal city, it's livable, it's got resilient communities, it's accessible and it's just. And this is probably one of the main challenges that CEA is facing still. So controlled environment agriculture, we keep saying CEA, so maybe we should stop using acronyms. I think sort of involving different types of controlled environment agriculture and mixing it with urban greenery, but also involving people as much as we can is key. But at the moment, I think the accessibility, so part of food security is having access, as you detailed in your presentation, Florence, and access means it's got to be affordable, but it also means that it's got to be culturally relevant. So, you know, if we produce food that where people don't know what to do with it, at the end of it, you know, it probably just gets wasted. And so I think there's so many different components, you know, socioeconomic components, systemic components. I think the technology is there. That's not the problem. So this is what I'm passionate about. You know, leverage the technology to solve all these problems. I think this is what we've got to do, and hopefully, you know, in a few years' time, efficiencies will have increased and prices will have come down, and involving people will be possible. And I think also when we talk about food insecurity, and we really noticed it during COVID, especially sort of more deprived areas, you know, there was huge food insecurity, and shouldn't, you know, we've got to find ways around this. We shouldn't be in a situation where, I don't have the stats now, I think you had them in your presentation, Florence, but this is something that, you know, we shouldn't be in a situation in the UK where we've got so many children not having the nutritious food. So, you know, this is something that I think all of us, you know, as we're sat here, share the same view and have the same driver.
Great, thank you, Nicole. Kevin, can I come to you?
Yes, thanks. It's a really interesting one, isn't it? When you actually link that, the food, something that should be a basic human right, and yet it's somehow something which we are challenged with. That there are people in society who don't have enough food to sustain themselves, and there are others with obesity problems based around the quality of the food that we have and the amount of food that we have in is disparate. And I think the way I'd approach this, if you're thinking about controlled environmental agriculture, if you think about what's on the tin in that label, what we have is a way of combating or mitigating some aspects of climate change. But we're not going to do that with fresh leafy salad crops. Let's put that to one side. That's something which is nice to have, but it's not essential. But if we combine the technology in the way that we were doing, so one of the projects I was involved in was Grow Up, taking some of what we'd learned from Paynton and seeing how we could feed that into the industry and support people along the way on their own journeys. And aquaculture linked to growing fresh leafy salad crops makes sense. You've got a protein product, you've got a fiber product. You can use the heat from within the warehouse to actually keep the costs down to grow both. You can also recirculate nutrients from the fish waste and turn that into the raw nutrients the plants need, and they can clean up the water to put back to the fish. You get closing loops. If you think about circular economies, if you think about systems thinking, if you think about controlled environmental agriculture, not just limited to crops, but thought about in terms of that context, with cities are really wasteful of the global resources. And as part of joining up that supply chain, we have waste to energy, energy to light and power to grow food, produce fish, and that way provide food for everyone. Now, I unlike others, I don't think CEA is something which we should spend an awful lot of money on to grow next to the food bank. I think actually our food supply system is really efficient, but it's a free market system. That's something else to take on board, which you picked up in your first talk, Florence, which was that you know, this, if we wanted to get rid of food poverty, we can do it. But when people are making money out of it, someone has to pay and other people aren't available. In the integrity of the current system, free market economy, neoliberal political systems, then why not make use of CEA in our packing sheds, at our distribution points, where they can feed into the hungry city using less heat, power, energy? Why don't we free up our land so they can grow food for staple systems that feed back into our cities more sustainably? And why not close loops? So rather than grow food here and send it halfway around the world, why not feed our hungry cities? We can actually get rid of some aspects of food poverty, but we can have a fairer distribution of it. So I'll leave that for that.
That's great. Thank you, Kevin. I'm going to bounce right back to you, Kevin, with a bit of a question on that, which I think will lead quite naturally into the next thing that I'd like to delve into. You say we should integrate these systems and into our distribution, etc. And we've also touched on, a number of you touched on sort of the limiting factor around the cost of these systems. They're very costly to set up. We're also, if you are looking to start a CEA farm, you're going to have a lot of money that you need to pay back. You're going to be looking to make a profit. So who are we looking to integrate these systems into to provide this hyper local, hyper fresh, high nutrition, accessible food? Who's going to be funding that? How can we break through those financial limitations to integrate those? Is it through government subsidy? Is it through what are your thoughts on that, Kevin?
Well, I mean, our food system is subsidised, isn't it? So, I mean, it's not a level playing field at the moment. If you're trying to start a controlled environmental farm in a peri-urban zone or in an urban zone, you're competing with produce which is being subsidised someplace else to be brought back in. The thing you need as a business is, as most of the people who've tried this will know, is you need an offtake agreement. Without an offtake agreement, you've got no way of actually securing that money or using that to leverage income, well, not income, but investment into your project. So that's a really important one. And the conclusion I came to at the end of our work and the subsequent thinking in between was that if you think about the real benefits of this, we've proven that you can grow food efficiently in a warehouse that could be located in a packing center. It could be, that packing center could be part of the distribution supply chain network. So it could be on top of your Asda's, your Tesco's. These are the logical models that make you feed in at the point of least resistance. As soon as you try to have a disruptive system apart from a supply chain that's very well set up and is feeding our hungry city, you're not just trying to innovate within your realm, you're trying to innovate across the sector. Actually, that's not going to help you break down those barriers. So if we genuinely want to have a sustainable business, then it needs to fit in with the existing supply chain, and where it disrupts it, it needs to bring something that's genuinely going to do that with either financial, environmental, or social gain.
Great, thank you. So just to expand on that topic a little bit before I come to, I think, Chris next. As well as potentially, working towards lower costs, more efficient systems so that we can bring down the price of that product and make it more accessible. What about low technology versions, open source things that people could build themselves to put in their own communities? What is there around along those lines? And do we see those two sort of working in synergy to be part of the solution? Chris, can I come to you on that?
Yeah, of course. No, I think that the low tech is really interesting, and just because it's low tech doesn't mean it can't be quite high yield. And one of the examples that I really like, and you talked about schools, and some of the schools were, starting to implement mid-tech kind of technology for growing food. But I've done some collaborations with companies in Australia who are doing like self-watering wicking beds, which are producing phenomenal yields from very small footprint, 2 car park spaces, and producing 450 kilos of fresh veg off 2 car parking spaces, for example. And that's helping schools offset some of the costs for school meals. It's helping them generate a bit of income sometimes. It's really inspiring kids to attend school, parents to send kids to school. So the social impact of that is huge, as well as the nutritional impact. And I noticed one thing from the first video you talked about, one of the things that people say about education is, but you're producing the most food during the summer holidays when the school's closed. But at the same time, the school environment is perhaps for a lot of kids the safest. And you saw with the Marcus Rashford story, in the summer, that's when the kids go the hungriest, because the school meal is the best meal that they get. So if you can combine some of those elements of the safety of the school environment, the inspiration of being able to grow a decent yield in a relatively low threshold way. Maybe you want to add some more high tech to be able to, you know, create more appealing meals if you're selling it. For example, you know, you grow your tomatoes and your salad stuff in the wicking bed. You get your lettuces and your herbs from the high tech. You package it together as a sellable meal. Then that can be quite a decent income generator, and you use some of the produce for your own school meals. I think that's pretty interesting from the education and social impact side, but it can also have quite a decent economic benefit as well. There's some of the schools that they were working with in Melbourne were really seeing significant impacts on their own budget, just offsetting the amount of money they were spending on the school meals, as well as, you know, generating money by selling food back to the community as well. And it create skills, and that's what it's about. Can you afford food is whether you're getting a decent income, right? So part of it is about training people to be able to have an income, not just access to cheap food. It should be access to good food and access to a decent income, right?
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Nicole, would you like to come in on this?
On the high versus low tech point, you mean?
Yeah, and making it accessible potentially economically.
Yeah, I agree with what Chris said. I mean, obviously, I come from a tech background, so I like high tech, but I am very aware of the so-called adequate technology. So I think technology should only ever be there to support the cause and the context. It shouldn't dictate the context. And this is why we tailor our technology, for example, to the context. So I totally agree that you don't always have to have high-tech solutions. They do have their place, but you know, you can have very, very productive setups with just simple, you know, hydroponics, just you know, just good nutrient solution, and you don't need thousands of sensors in there. So. So from that point of view, I'm in total agreement. The one thing that I keep thinking when we're talking about sort of the commercial side of controlled environment agriculture, I'm missing this usual like component, which is called people and social capital. This is something that is notoriously hard to quantify. And if we're thinking about, I mean, we mentioned earlier, malnutrition, you know, malnutrition in a sense can also mean obesity and you know, lack of micronutrients, and if we manage to make locally grown food, it's not rocket science. I mean, if you harvest fresh food and that's grown locally, it's good for the environment because you cut down the transportation costs, but also the nutritional value is a lot higher than if you're shipping it, you know, from the other end of Europe, and it's been lying there for a few days. I mean, that I think is obvious to everybody. But at the same time, you know, the other thing that we keep forgetting is if we teach, especially young children or young adults, what actually means to have a healthy diet, and actually make it fun as well. You know, I think it's not just about producing it, it's also teaching them what to do with it. You know, I mentioned the cultural element earlier. I think that is hugely important to kind of, you know, make them realize how to prepare the food as well, in order to retain the nutritional value. And if we think about the future, you know, the savings, if we do manage to encourage a mind shift, as well as boosting the availability of healthy produce, then, you know, again, we can quantify this later down the line in terms of, you know, benefits to the health system. You know, people might just end up living healthier lifestyles. So, you know, to me, it's not just about sort of the bottom line of, you know, we want to make a profit when we grow produce commercially. There's more to the story, and that's called social capital, for wanting a better word.
No, it's a great turn of phrase. Okay, fantastic. I'm going to jump to Andrew to speak on that, and just to remind all of our attendees that you can drop your questions. You can do it through the Slido. You're also welcome to drop them in the chat. We've got a couple more questions, and then we'd love to pass over to you guys. So do share any thoughts as well as questions with us. Andrew, do you want to jump in on that sort of working towards sort of accessible tech and accessible prices?
Yeah. Well, I think for sure, low to medium tech farms is actually the most proven technology out there. If we look at the Netherlands, for instance, the Netherlands is the second largest exporter of food in the world, and they have huge glass houses. These glass houses, yeah, they're not super high tech like you would imagine with a vertical farm, but just by using the power of the sun, they can crank out these enormous amounts of food. And so, yes, these super high tech indoor farms where we use LEDs, they can, in many situations, be fruitful, but we shouldn't forget how powerful the sun is. And taking a step back, looking at glass houses, greenhouses, things like that, using this technology in lots of areas will help boost controlled indoor agriculture. I think also in terms of making this food accessible, it's important to think about the distribution of it. For instance, here in Glasgow, we're working with an NGO, and they've basically looked at the local food economy here in Glasgow, tried to identify the areas of weakness, and through that weakness, they've sort of come with the collectors. They found several growers groups, be that, you know, small city allotments, Glasgow Greens, for instance, other glass houses, and they've come together and they've developed a food plan. So this food plan identifies, as I said, the areas of weakness and tries to plot in the production of all these different types of growing, so your greenhouse, your indoor and whatnot, and deliver that straight to the areas of need. So through that, you're obviously missing out the middleman. The middleman takes 50% of the cut. So if you can cut that out of the chain, then this the technology, all the different technologies can work together to really boost the food economy. So I think, yeah, it's important for cities especially to take a step back, think locally, how do we maximize the efficiency? And often that is, thinking locally.
Great. Yeah, it reminded me of a fantastic greenhouse, Gotham Greens. They grow on top of supermarkets in America, and they just have big greenhouses growing hydroponically, and the basil and the lettuce are all absolutely fantastic and super fresh. They go into the supermarket underneath, and you know, I'm sure that I can't imagine we won't have a future where in the supermarkets there will be fresh growing hydroponic lettuces there for the plucking. It's certainly the future that I would like to, future supermarket that I would like to see. And I want to just jump move on to education quickly before we take a few questions from our audience. It's been mentioned by a number of you. It, of course, was mentioned in my first presentation, and it's something that's very close to my heart. It's clearly a very powerful tool, as Nicole touched on, about teaching, you know, about nutrition, and many of you mentioned as well. I wonder what you see. I mean, for me, it's that is a systemic solution, really giving young people insight into how to live a healthy life, how to be entrepreneurial, how to look after the planet through food. You know, there's so much systemic solution in that model. Where do you think that the industry as a whole plays in to that? How can they contribute to increasing education through urban agri-tech? I'm going to come to you, Nicole. We'll have to keep these reasonably concise answers so we can get some.
Keep it brief. I think access is the key word, and visibility. I think there are two things. We shouldn't be hiding everything away on a rooftop where people can't see. So I think the industry should provide more visibility to the public, and engage the public more. Citizen engagement I think is another key term.
Yeah, I think there's something
about brief.
That was great. No, that was great. Something about normalization, isn't it? And just making it part of everyday life.
Exactly.
Chris.
Yeah, it's great. I did a very quick study as part of a presentation for a big international school, And I basically used the car park. They have 140 car parking spaces outside the school. So that's something that everybody sees every time they come to school, every time they leave the school. And so I took various different ways of growing and just say to the kids, if you took out 140 car parking spaces, how much could you grow? And how would that translate into portions per kid? Just to make it really, really visual. And so they start to understand that, because often people say, yeah, but it's not going to make a dent. You know, growing in cities is only going to make a small dent. But if you look at it in the context of education, it can make a huge dent, and then it can really start inspiring people. And you've got your market already there. And if you could grow it here, you've already got, you know, like in that case, it was 1,500 hungry mouths. And we worked out that off their car park, they could all have, 1,500 kids could have 85 portions, 250 grams each in a 12-month period. So that's not insignificant. You know, that's 85 meals that you don't need to pay for because you've grown it yourself, in theory. And I think making it visual, allowing people to brainstorm it, teaching people how to, there's so much you can teach with food, right? You can teach everything from just basics of cooking to real, you know, high-tech physics and science and chemistry or whatever you want. And when you bring it into the school context and make it really visual and really actual, then it becomes a very powerful tool.
Fantastic, thank you. Kevin, I'll come to you.
Yeah, well, you've hit why I've come back into education, and I've worked in that interface between the public and what happens within our sectors. For me, I think agriculture and urban agriculture, in terms of that broader aspect, low tech, high tech, if you're growing, if you can get close to the plant, and if you understand how to grow a plant well, you understand its inputs. And by understanding the inputs, you also understand the weakness in that system. You understand what it's fragile to, and that empathy with your food, where it comes from, how it's produced into something, whether we cook with that, whether we turn it into a preserve, whether it forms into a meal. All of those aspects, as others have highlighted, form part of a journey of discovery, where people ask questions, and actually learning happens when we get them to ask questions. And it's through answering those questions that they gain through our unsustainable food system. We want them to come up with better, more innovative ways to close those loops and come up with sustainable solutions. And the more examples that you can actually give them to play with, unpick, ask questions about, challenge us about, the better for all of us, isn't it? I think that's the thing I would put there. And I think there's also an opportunity, because COVID has provided a shock. I'm involved in various projects across the schools where we're seeing that there is that people are finding food, finding green spaces, and really asking questions about their own role in that system in the future, even looking to change careers. I think if we're going to make a difference, probably united, coming forward with an education solution is something that would be welcomed by public, by schools, by further education colleges, and even by universities.
Fantastic, thank you. And finally, Andrew, who has worked in the education field as well, would you like to step in to add to this one?
Yeah, no, as Florence says, I did back when I was working with Farm Urban, we engaged with workshops in schools, and that was definitely some of the highlights of my time doing that internship. Seeing how engaged children of all ages, from young primary to later in secondary, all being engaged in different ways, and it's definitely a really powerful tool. So I think education is subsidized, so I think there's a definite case for controlled environment agriculture businesses bouncing off these education workshops, letting these education workshops become a core part of their business. This will promote STEM, promote thoughts about food security, and just getting kids thinking about their food and where it comes from. It may seem simple, but I think it has really powerful effects. So I think, I think Farm Urban is a company that has proven that this way of this model works. So for other companies to try and hitch on the back of that and see what they can do, I think that's definitely hopefully a solution for integrating education and agriculture.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think that's a really really good point, that integration of and you know, the term that Nicole used, that social capital, and finding ways for the industry to really be able to open their doors and engage. Great. We've got some questions coming in. I'm actually going to jump to Mark, who's been keeping an eye on some of those questions, and ask him to pull out some for us. Mark?
Thanks. Really, really interesting discussion, and thank you all. I could personally sit here and just quiz the lot of you for the rest of the evening with questions that I want to ask. I will work to get around to questions that people have asked, but first I am going to slightly abuse Chairman's privilege to ask a question that I want to ask, which is that, you know, some of you talked about like culturally appropriate. I think Nicole mentioned that, and kind of technologically appropriate was another question. And you might argue there's kind of locally appropriate, environmentally appropriate, all these different categories. And sometimes those things work together. Sometimes they sit along slightly parallel tracks, and sometimes they're even divergent, you know, particularly when you look at kind of economics. So without, you know, obviously we've only got a limited amount of time, but what sort of mechanisms and approaches do you guys think we could be using to sort of work out what is the right context in the right place and situation to figure these things out? And I will arbitrarily pick up Andrew first.
Yeah, I guess just quickly then, I mean, I think taking it back to the local level again, identifying the needs of the local area is probably the best way. Setting out a national plan for urban agritech, I feel might miss the core of what needs to be addressed. So I think personally, taking it back to the local level and identifying local needs is the best way of doing it.
Yeah, could I jump in as well? I think it's hugely important when you're looking at site specific and working with communities that you don't go in with a plan. You go in and talk to the community and ask them what they want and if they want it, and work with people for solutions that suit them. That's very, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Nicole, anything you want to add there?
One word: co-creation.
Okay.
That's a brilliantly short and simple answer.
Basically what Florence said. Totally agree.
Okay. Chris, anything you want to add there?
No, I mean, when you look at it from the urban design point of view, you've got on the one hand, you do your market analysis of what you're importing, what are you growing locally, to make sure that what you start to grow new, you're not doubling up on something, or you're not trying to compete with something you can't compete with. So you're trying to identify what to grow from that point of view, but also what I'm doing with other people is a quick scan of what are the leftover spaces, the abandoned buildings, what are the potential, what are the different typologies where we might be able to grow, and then looking back at what's the appropriate technology to try and implement in those places next to what kind of foods are useful to grow in that context. So it's a bit of everything, but you have to look at the whole systems approach.
Okay, and last but by no means least, Kevin, just to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think, I mean, again, local, but I'd go maybe regional as well. There's a big movement towards bioregional work, which is at a catchment level. It's a scale we can cope with. It's also then cuts down some of the political boundaries, because food growing regions tend to be more focused on natural basins and water courses, and water is really important. The other thing I'd say is, if you look at some great work that's gone on at Bristol with where does your food come from, and having food discussions, opening that up within community to find out what people want, but also those points of pressure and inflection. Those are the weak points that you can go after. And I think a food map is a great way of having a discussion. So if you think of it from a kind of, you know, we like sitting around tables looking at maps and pointing out where things come from, but also flows help us. And I'll just chuck something at you that I know I shared with you before, Mark, but it fits in well here, which is von Thunen in 1700 talked about the isolated state, and where he showed, you know, how the city zoning then worked for feeding, with the market gardens taking the night soil from the cities, looking at the dairy herds that were taking fresh produce in each day, looking at the forest belts beyond that, looking at the grain belts beyond that, looking at where the animals were beyond. Now, our food doesn't work that way anymore, system. And breaking it down, you can see, where does society want to make a difference? Where's it important for them? And actually, we don't do it for us, do we? You can't impose it. It's so I agree with very much with Florence that it's got to be community driven. All you can do is give them the information and help them make an informed decision and work towards it.
Brilliant, thank you. I mean, yeah, there seems to be a general theme and an agreement there. So moving on to some of the questions that we've received. This one, as I say, if someone has put their name, then I might ask them to say it out loud, but otherwise anonymous, I'll ask them. Florence, I'm actually going to chuck this one at you first, since I think this might fit quite well with where you're at with things. We've got a question here, which is there any good evidence to suggest that money spent on urban agriculture, CEA or otherwise, can offset the costs of addressing social issues?
The very short answer is not that I'm aware of. There might well be. I mean, certainly any investment in, if it's looking at kind of investment in health of a community, will have positive benefits in terms of saving costs or on NHS, etc. There's a social prescribing has been shown to cut costs and for the NHS. So you can do cost analyses to see how certain interventions play out on a social scale. So if you were investing in CEA in a kind of community setting, for example, like in the video that we saw in the presentation, we saw the community food bank in an American city that I can't recall. I'm sure that influx of fresh vegetables was having a positive effect on the health of the recipients, which no doubt was reducing expenditure in other areas such as healthcare. However, obviously those systems are very expensive to put in the place. So the short answer is I'm not sure, but I hope it is the case.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. I mean, in the interest of time, I'm not going to throw every question out to everybody, but do any of our other panelists have a particular knowledge of any information in that area? Yeah, Chris, go on.
No, I mean, I think it's very much on a case-by-case basis, but there's some really good examples. If you look at what Project Eats are doing in New York and Brooklyn, then they've also got documentation about how the implementation of their community farming strategies had an impact on, reduced crime on the streets, because left over the wasteland where the dodgy stuff went on is now the heart of the community. People have got occupation. There's more social surveillance. The school attendance was higher. The visits to the doctor was lower. They've got that data based around what their individual project was doing, and you see the same from various schools as well. Like school attendance went up. Reported sick days went down. So on a case by case basis, I think there is, but structurally, I think it's still lacking.
No,
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a really good point that I didn't pick up on was the education thing. I mean, you look at Green Bronx Machine in the poorest congressional district in the States, and the young people from that school, their achievement levels, their ability to contribute to society and to the economy, the drop in sort of crime rates from the young people that are passing through that school thanks to this program are going to have huge social benefits and cost savings further down the line.
Okay, so there is some sort of locally structured stuff, but there's potentially a role there to increase the amount of information that's available out there on a more sort of structural or systemic level, and that's maybe something that needs to be worked on, which is a good thing, because we should always be identifying things that we can work on in future. I'm going to move on. I've got a question here from Silvio Caputo. If you want to unmute yourself and ask your question. Are you there?
I think
hello,
perhaps...
can you hear me?
We can, yeah.
Yeah, hello. Well, thank you. I'll turn the camera on. Well, thank you for this debate. It's absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much to all the speakers and to the panel and to you who organized it. Well, my question, the question that I posted is about the crops that are usually grown in CEA, vertical farming, hydroponics or aquaponics. To an extent, Kevin answered already. If you put proteins into the mix of what can be grown and produced in a CEA context, then it makes sense. But all the small farms, urban farms that I have visited and that I know, they may grow farm fish because they grow with aquaponics, but what they grow is leafy greens and microgreens, because these crops will have a high return, high value. These are high value crops. Otherwise, the business model does not work. And so there are two issues here. One, if we need to address food security, then the basket of crops grown in an urban context in CEA needs to be wider. Not only leafy greens and microgreens, because with salads we will not solve food security. And the second point is, in terms of scaling up urban agriculture, a CEA-based urban agriculture, can you think of scaling up the production of lettuce and the production of microgreens? The market would not have sufficient demand for that production. So I think, I think it's a fascinating concept, and I'm all for it. But I think that it needs to be, is still not at the level that can be really scaled up and you know, embraced totally.
Okay.
So that is my, is a kind of a provocation, because I am a promoter of CEA.
Okay. No, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, I'll just quickly, I guess I'll chuck this one to maybe Andrew, just sort of some thoughts on, you know, what sort of crops and scalability. We've got to be fairly quick. We're going to run over a little bit here, but I think that'll be all right for the minute.
Well, I think definitely correct in some respects, although, for instance, the hospitality industry, they have a huge, and I think once COVID is released a bit, there is a huge demand for these leafy greens, and maybe not so much microgreens, but leafy greens in general. And you are correct. I think the general public appetite for leafy greens may not be so severe, but there is still a large market for these leafy greens within the hospitality industry. And if in that production away from, for instance, Spain, where it's all done right now, bringing it to the UK, that definitely has its benefits. But yeah, in terms of expanding the palette, it's definitely required. But I think, again, in terms of that, you don't need to limit yourself to thinking about vertical farming. Glasshouses and greenhouses can grow lots of other things very well. Tomatoes, fruits, strawberries, bigger things like courgettes and whatnot. So in terms of vertical farming, yeah, maybe, I mean, a lot more technology developments is required, but I think thinking on a larger scope, there's definitely a lot of room for growth.
Okay, great. Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to do just one more question. It's a bit of a wide one, so I'm just going to throw this out to the panel. So fingers on buzzers, you know, whoever wants to go first, kind of shout out. Do you believe, and this is a big question, do you believe that CEA will contribute to a more resilient and sustainable system in the coming years? I will take answers. Yeah, go on, Nicole.
Yes, I do. I think it does have its place in the food system, but I think it's not. I don't think it's a silver bullet. It's hugely context specific, so it depends on where we are and what the context is in terms of being able to determine what the adequate crop is. But I don't see it as the silver bullet in isolation. It's got to be part of the system. So it's got to be integrated with other types of agriculture, maybe integrated with traditional, conventional agriculture, in the process steps. Short answer, yes, I think it does have its place, but not in isolation.
Okay. Anyone else want to throw in a thought there? Florence, you put your hand up?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in just to add to that. I think the key word is contribute. And just to sort of reflect as well on Silvio's question and build on what Nicole said, there is no silver bullet changing for city food systems to create healthy, resilient, sustainable food systems is an incredibly complex challenge, and there are many elements that will come together to get us there, and includes shifting diets and behaviour, which will in turn increase demand for leafy greens and healthier diets, and we'll do that through education, which might also interplay with the development of CEA and this accessibility and visibility and the role that they might play in increasing that education. So it's definitely going to play a contributory role, but I think on the scale of things, it's probably not going to be a major one.
Yeah, Kevin, go on.
Mark, just I mean, building upon both of those answers, I think one of the things I'll reflect back is, so far, everything we've done has either been raised by the market or done on a voluntary footing. We're just about to see significant funding. I mean, James Hutton Institute, just down the road from me, have got their Advanced Plants Growth Centre, and that will be looking to grow the widest range of crops, but also all of our crops so far have been developed to grow in soil, not hydroponic systems in vertical farms. So we're really at the beginning. We've got the Model T Ford out there. It's been privately and publicly funded in really, by little bits of seed funding. The next range that I believe will come through is evidence-based science, helping us get there. If we want to start to get to the moon and you're starting with a horse and a cart, you've got a long way to go, haven't you? But we did it. And I think controlled environmental agriculture has to play a role in climate change, where, quite frankly, we've messed up the global systems, and what we're currently growing from in the future won't be available to that next generation. So they've got to do it differently. We've got to do it more efficiently. And it has to start with an evidence-based science. That's where I'm going to put it.
Okay. I guess, yeah, I mean, I guess I could say I could go on all night, but we are about at time. In fact, we're a few minutes over. So I'm going to take the opportunity to thank all of our panelists, Nicole, Andrew, Chris and Kevin, and a special thanks to Florence for both this and for the part one. It's been really good. Thank you to all of you who came along to watch the event and for all of your questions. Sorry if we didn't get to you. Feel free to reach out to the panelists via the usual kind of things, LinkedIn and so on. And yeah, thanks for coming along, and we'll see you all somewhere else before too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks very much for putting it together.